This is terror. This is fear. This is panic. This is planet Earth, reminding its inhabitants nature is still in charge. And few places on Earth are as vulnerable to the capricious whims of Earth's seismic tantrums than California, where 14 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater have struck over the past 165 years. 2019, 7.1, Ridgecrest. 1994, 6.7, Northridge. 1989, 6.9, Loma Prieta. 1971, 6.6, Sylmar. As devastating as those major California earthquakes were, they pale in comparison to two earlier in the 20th century. 1906, 7.8, San Francisco, killing as many as 3,000 and displacing nearly 250,000. But the earthquake few remember today, unless they lived it, is this. 1952, 7.3 in Kern County. 70 years ago today, at 4:52 a.m., the third largest earthquake in recorded California history devastated the towns of Tehachapi and Arvin. Seismic activity shook chandeliers and nerves for 33 long days that hot San Joaquin Valley summer, culminating in what we remember today as the Bakersfield earthquake of August 22nd, 1952, the Tehachapi quake's deadly bookend. The Kern County main shock of July 21st, 1952, centered near Tehachapi, was 7.5 by some estimates, the state's fifth strongest and the equivalent in sheer power, scientists said at the time, of 2,000 atom bombs. The month-long series of earth shocks damaged perhaps 1,000 buildings in Kern County, 260 of them significantly. At least 90 were deemed unsafe and eventually torn down. Those quakes left an indelible mark on the brick and mortar character and the psyches of the communities they hit. Perhaps even worse, they represented a giant missed opportunity for urban reinvention. In the name of cost savings, convenience, and perhaps the misguided pursuit of something, quote, modern, Bakersfield leaders opted to tear down historically significant, classically designed buildings that might have been salvageable and replace them with the more mundane rectangles typical of the 50s and 60s architecture. The Bakersfield earthquake of 1952 didn't just damage and destroy buildings, it affected people and the opportunity to be something more. This is the story of those buildings, those people, and that missed opportunity.
And of course it was a big boom.
I was in my car and all of a sudden the car's moving around.
I was just there a couple of days when the earthquake hit.
And people were starting to pour out of the buildings.
You could tell what it was.
And there was big cracks in the street.
At 4:52 a.m., 4 minutes before sunrise, Monday, July 21st, 1952, a flash of blue light shot across the eastern horizon, and the White Wolf Fault, previously considered less consequential than other California fault lines, introduced itself with a violent and prolonged spasm. Sandy Souza, 8 years old, was asleep in bed with her little sister at their home 40 miles west of the epicenter in Bakersfield. Their double bed, on wheels, spun across the uncarpeted floor like young Dorothy's from The Wizard of Oz.
My mom grabbed me and my one sister, who were in a double bed sleeping together, and the bed was rolling around in the room. My biggest memory is neighbors sleeping outside. They'd take their mattresses out and laid them on the ground because they didn't want to sleep in a house.
One's own house, the place people felt most secure, suddenly held danger.
But the thing that you really felt after you went back to bed, when you finally got enough nerve to go back to bed and, you know, not be there with your parents, was the aftershocks. They were pretty heavy.
Bakersfield Californian columnist Jim Day, whose column Pipefuls was published for 40 years, captured some of the humor of the otherwise terrifying first moments of the quake. He wrote about one unidentified couple who burst out of their home completely naked and only after sprinting some distance down the street, stopped and realized what they'd revealed to the world. Another woman, he wrote, darted out of her home dressed only in a purse. For most others, the moments after that pre-dawn earthquake were considerably more serious. At least 5 elevated water storage tanks came crashing down, 2 in Bakersfield and 3 in Tehachapi, resulting in one fatality.
Instantaneous.
22-year-old insurance salesman Ken Vetter, who years later would serve on the Bakersfield City Council and the Bakersfield Police Commission, was asleep in his tiny apartment off Bernard Street when he was jolted to his feet. The steel spider legs of the 100-foot-tall elevated water tank across the street, 300 feet away, had buckled, and the tank crashed to the ground and burst open, sending 250,000 gallons of water, peppered with hundreds of steel rivets, gushing toward him.
All the debris, furniture, bed, and all was all piled up at the end of the room.
In Tehachapi, which took the brunt of that first earthquake, 12 people were killed, most in a horrific building collapse. 6 adults and 18 children were asleep in the rear of a 2-story furniture store when it imploded, burying them under tons of brick and timber. 9 died, 8 of them children. Their blanket-covered bodies were stored in a makeshift morgue at the Tehachapi fire station until the county coroner could get there. Betty Chambers, a young mother of 2, was staying in Tehachapi with her teenage brother Donnie while their parents vacationed out of the area. Donnie was sleeping directly beneath a huge hunting trophy mounted on the wall.
The deer head he had right over his bed, and it fell off and just missed him. And it was a big several horn thing, and it just missed stabbing him. So he was pretty lucky there.
Downtown Tehachapi looked like it had been bombed. Dirt, bricks, debris everywhere. Power lines down, gas lines broken.
The hotel on the corner was completely demolished, and downtown where the Roundup bar was, that whole block was gone.
The 2-story Juanita Hotel lost walls on all 4 sides, and beds were hanging over the exposed lip of the upper floor. A second shock, magnitude 5.0, hit at 8:55 a.m. that day, 4 hours after the jarring first quake, sending Tehachapi residents still dazed by the first quake, running down the street screaming. Walls weakened 4 hours earlier, started coming down. The cataclysm made national news.
All over the country, this huge big earthquake. Nobody could pronounce Tehachapi. They would be giving a news report from New York or somewhere, and they would call it Tehachapi or you know, weird names. They couldn't seem to get Tehachapi right.
Locals still refer to the July 21st seismic event as the Tehachapi earthquake, but Arvin was hard hit as well. In fact, the 12th and final victim of that earthquake was fatally injured in Arvin. 3 days after the quake, aftershocks were still shattering windows from Mojave to Bakersfield. By this time, the terror had given way to resignation. The Bakersfield Californian put it this way: in Tehachapi, sad-eyed residents of the quake-torn little town ignored the rumbling and kept at their tasks of clearing up rubble. 70% of the buildings in Tehachapi were declared, quote, worthless by a team of building inspectors. 7 of the area's 15 train tunnels were damaged, and one 300-foot section caved in because of the earth movement. Jittery locals, proving they still had some sense of humor, started calling their ravaged town Quakersfield. As shaken as the Kern County residents were, there was more to come.
I thought that an oil well had blown up.
And boom, the earthquake hit.
First thing I asked was, uh-oh, did the clock tower go?
That summer of 1952, a young musician named Alvis Edgar Buck Owens, playing a Fender Telecaster guitar he purchased used the year before for $35, was making a name for himself at honky-tonks like the Blackboard. College football All-American Frank Gifford, 4 years out of Bakersfield High School, was preparing for his rookie year with the New York Giants. And the Korean War raged on. 7 boys from Bakersfield had already been killed. Caltech seismologists fought to ease fears by proclaiming that the worst was over. Danger of another big earthquake believed past, the Bakersfield, California newspaper announced. 3 weeks later, after a 22-day lapse in significant activity, the aftershock we've come to know as the Bakersfield earthquake, a magnitude 5.8 event at 3:41 p.m. on August 22nd.
And we were out in the backyard when we heard all this shaking and whatever.
7-year-old Fuchsia Ward's family had just moved to southeast Bakersfield from Arkansas, where they had experienced brutal discrimination and long days in the cotton fields. They hoped those days were over. But then, this.
Because at that time, Bob, I never heard of an earthquake. And my grandmother said, "It's an earthquake, it's an earthquake."
12-year-old Hank Webb was in the back of his sister's car at that moment when they got a flat tire, or so they thought.
I looked towards town, there was just a giant cloud of dust. So my sister drove, well, we got to go see this. So we drove down, and when we reached Truxton, we could see that chunks of the clock tower had fallen down.
That afternoon, Ken Brenneman, just 2 days from his 9th birthday, was at the California Theater on Chester Avenue with his older brother Tom and Cynthia, the girl who lived across the street. The boy's mother had dropped off the three of them to watch a re-release of the 1933 movie King Kong with Fay Wray and Robert Armstrong. The theater had been showing cartoons and previews. Young Ken decided this would be a good time to pee.
So I put my foot on the first step to go upstairs, and boom, the earthquake hit. So I grabbed the handrail and just kind of stayed there where everything was shaking.
Young Brenneman was almost knocked over by a movie theater usher bolting down the stairs. Years later, Brenneman, who worked as a bartender at Bill Lee's Bamboo Chopsticks for 55 years, was talking about the '52 earthquake with a regular customer, Phil the mailman, as he was known to all. Phil mentioned he'd worked as an usher at the California Theater that day, up in the balcony.
So I grabbed him by his shirt and pulled him over a little bit, and I said, "You remember that little kid at the bottom of the stairs you ran over? That was me."
In the summer of '52, Tommy Hayes played guitar and sang at a local honky-tonk on Edison Highway, the Lucky Spot. And on August 22nd, he was at a local finance company selling his motorcycle to fellow musician Louis Talley.
And I was in there signing papers for the motorcycle, and that earthquake hit. And everything started shaking and rattling. So my instinct was to get out of there. So I did. I ran out in the middle of the street, and I forgot where I parked my car. So I turned around and looked at the brick building, and I just ran out of it. And the cracks were about 10 of them. They were just going like this from the streets up to the top of the building. So I thought the bricks are going to fall right on me out here. So I ran back inside.
In the days that followed, businesses salvaged what merchandise they could and evacuated their damaged buildings. Montgomery Ward, a catalog store on Chester Avenue, was so seriously damaged, managers set up shop in tents on F Street. Some government functions even moved outdoors. Here, a Kern County Superior Court judge hands down a prison sentence to a convicted man in a city park. Among civic leaders' most pressing duties, after providing food, shelter, and medical attention, the most basic human needs, was what to do about all the damaged buildings. Bakersfield City Hall was abandoned and marked for demolition, as was most of Kern County General Hospital. So was the Beale Memorial Clock Tower, which since 1904 had occupied the middle of the intersection of 17th and Chester. A replica was commissioned at the Kern County Museum, safely to the side of the road, where it remains to this day. Also condemned were both Kern County courthouses, the 1896 building, which had been converted into the city jail, and its 1912 replacement. The August earthquake damaged them both to the point where little was deemed salvageable. One noteworthy exception was the 1912 courthouse's 4 striking limestone warrior maidens, Trojan women as they were called at the time, each 8 feet tall and positioned 65 feet above the street. They were carefully removed with cranes and preserved for some later purpose, which turned out to be their own exhibit at the Kern County Museum. Bob Parsons, an industrial arts teacher at Bakersfield High School, gathered fallen bricks to create a sort of earthquake commemoration, according to his wife, Pat.
We had been building this little house, and he wanted to build a fireplace, so he went out and collected bricks from everywhere.
That fireplace still stands at the Parsons' old house near the corner of Bank and Oleander. Several houses of worship, including the Episcopal Church, were sentenced to demolition, as were at least 4 schools: Fremont, Emerson, Lincoln, and Fairfax.
It was just heartbreaking to me. It just made me sick to see some of the buildings.
The Kern County Jail at Truxton Avenue and Q Street was so damaged, Sheriff Tom Kelly had to move 50 tons of files to the basement to relieve weight on the damaged upper floors. The building was eventually condemned, and the two distinctive stone lions at its entrance were auctioned off. The winning bid, $175 to a college fraternity in Reno. The city jail's lions weren't the only noteworthy examples of public art to become casualties of the Kern County earthquakes of 1952. There was a loss of architectural character that the city never recovered from.
And the whole brick wall had fallen down on top of a car, and seeing telephone poles doing a dance.
This is Kern County. This is a land of magic. Vast valleys rich in agricultural and petroleum resources. A state and national leader in production of oil and farm products.
The earthquakes of 1952 cost Kern County's two leading industries millions of dollars. Hundreds of oil wells were damaged. Some, their casings crushed, stopped producing altogether. Some started spitting out sand or salt water, although one well inexplicably doubled its output. The industry returned to its normal level of operation in 2 or 3 weeks, however, with the Paloma refinery south of the city on Millix Road the only significant and long-lasting casualty. Aqueducts throughout the county cracked and split apart, washing out rural farm roads, drying out irrigation lines, and depriving thirsty grapes and cotton of water at a crucial point in the growing season. The presence of so many oil company-affiliated geologists, though, made the Tehachapi earthquake and its aftershocks the most thoroughly studied seismic incident in human history. Over the next several years, the look of the city was transformed, and not, as many critics say, in a good way. Gone were the Art Deco, neo-Gothic buildings featuring decorative finials, patterns, scalloping, and moldings with heavily arched windows. Gone were the Beaux-Arts, the neoclassical French and Italian, and other influences that, building upon each other by the decade, effectively told the city's story. Consider the 1912 courthouse and its boxy 1959 replacement at Chester and Truxton Avenues.
Modern and functional in design, is one of the finest in California. Developed under county government leadership, it includes a 7-story courts and administration building.
One of the taller downtown buildings spared the wrecking ball was this 4-story office building at 19th and Chester, the Hopkins Building, built in 1904 and remodeled in 1919. The top 3 floors were deemed unsafe for occupancy and remain so today. 3 ghost floors that still have the names of their 1952 tenants on the doors. Lawyers, dentists, advertising agencies, etched in smoked glass, just as they were when time stood still 70 years ago.
So many of our buildings were just knocked down instead of preserved for the historical value.
Did they need to knock down so many of them?
No, I'm sure they didn't, in my opinion.
Structural engineers considered the damage inflicted on Bakersfield's government and commercial buildings and determined, no doubt accurately, that it would cost more to stabilize and repair than to raise and build from scratch. It doesn't factor art, tradition, sentiment, sense of place, or the very real economic benefits of identity, the kind of identity buildings of consequence can bestow on a city. If Bakersfield had reinforced and preserved more of those damaged buildings, it would surely look different now, and it would feel different. The city did preserve and protect buildings in some cases. 125 older structures, most of them downtown, are inspected after every significant seismic event. The most recent reinspection, however, was 2018. Another 25 are vulnerable and by state law must either be used strictly for storage or post notices near their door advising visitors that buildings are unreinforced. We checked a half-dozen such buildings, however, and found only this unoccupied building with the required posting. Phil Burns, Bakersfield's building director, said the 1952 earthquake was the impetus behind the creation of certain building codes.
Back then they didn't really have earthquake codes, so it was later, much later, more into the 80s and 90s, that there was a push to make these buildings safer.
Many unreinforced masonry buildings are recognizable from the street by these bolted metal plates, which are attached to threaded metal rods that run through the attic space and are secured on the other end. No URM or unreinforced masonry building is earthquake proof, certainly not old brick buildings fortified with metal rods, but they help. Some businesses go the extra mile. Businesses like Two Goats and the Goose, a Wall Street alley restaurant, where these huge vertical steel beams seem capable of at least slowing a worst-case avalanche of brickwork that dates to 1901. That's what Santa Barbara officials did following that region's 1925 earthquake, a magnitude 6.5 shaker that lasted 19 seconds. Santa Barbara's business district had been a hodgepodge of architectural styles: Victorian, Moorish, Tunisian, Spanish colonial. The earthquake devastated 36 blocks, requiring substantial demolition and reconstruction.
My name is Neil Graff.
City leaders, according to Santa Barbara historian Neil Graffy, saw it as an opportunity. They rebuilt in a unified, themed style that created and preserved a distinct sense of place.
After the earthquake, very quickly after the earthquake, these people got together and came up with plans in a Spanish style, or what the newspapers called the Santa Barbara style. And they offered these plans for free for the facades for most of these buildings along State Street. And if it was free, the owners of the buildings quickly grabbed them, and so we were able to rebuild in this beautiful style, this uniform building code.
Victorian buildings suddenly had Spanish tile roofs and hacienda balconies. When Santa Barbara suffered seismic damage 27 years later, ironically, from the much larger Kern County earthquakes of 1952, it rebuilt again. Perhaps Bakersfield will have another opportunity for earthquake-aided urban renewal. Not that the city should be anticipating with any sort of eagerness the sort of devastation that costs so much in terms of lives lost and landmarks destroyed 70 years ago. But the fact is, Bakersfield is situated on and near a network of faults that shift with regularity and shift violently. The moral of this story: remember and learn. California is, after all, earthquake country, and we in Bakersfield are right in the middle of it. For 17 News, I'm Robert Price.
You know, everybody's shaking their head wondering if the world had come to an end.
The hotel was completely demolished.
On my part, it was a wall that was taken out.
You didn't know if something else was going to start shaking?
It was Bandhauer's Market. It was demolished.
They were within minutes. They were on patrol looking for looters.
And the theater right down the street was demolished.
Well, it was just startling, unbelievable. You know, you were frightened.
In those years, there was not nearly the traffic.
The schools were damaged and they couldn't use the school. Sounded like the earthquake, just like a